glad I'm back at school, so I am too. That's where I belong. So anyway, what we're going to do with this class is just use the Bible as a resource for the women that we're going to talk about, and also to use the Quran or Quran, depending on your preference of pronunciation, because there is a lot of information about the women that we meet in the Bible, in the Islamic text as well. And so we have to really look at both sources, I think, to really get a good, solid picture of what these women were like. I think that there is a lot of misconception about women in the Bible. I know all of my growing up years, I was taught that the women of the Bible were subservient. They lived under the authority of their father until he married them off to someone, maybe of their choosing and maybe not. And then they became the property of the husband. This is not true. It is true of the pagan culture, but it is not necessarily true of the Hebrew culture. The Jewish men had a very different concept of women. So looking at that, it gives you an idea that a lot of assumptions that we make about women in the Bible are not necessarily true. Yes, there was a very strict and rigid law that the Hebrew women had to follow, and if they didn't, there could be serious consequences. But if you measure that up against the pagan culture of the time, and all of those different pagan cults, you see that the Jewish women really did not have it so bad. So I've given you some characteristics of just briefly, what life was like for these women in pagan cultures during the biblical times. Property of the father and then the husband, little more dignity than an animal, because the wife or the daughter was owned. She was considered property. So a man could have X number of cattle and X number of wives, and they were pretty much on the same level. As long as the cattle did what it was supposed to do, the man took good care of them. If it was a rebel cow or a rebel ram, then they were not treated fairly or with any sort of courtesy. In the pagan cultures, we have those gods and goddesses that feature very prominently. Every cult had its favorite god or goddess, and that individual would have their shrine to them where the pagan people went and paid offerings and worshipped. So this is a different level of individual than what we think of with just a pagan woman who belonged to a certain cult. So in the temples, in these shrines to the goddesses, they all had priestesses who worked for that particular cult. They were essentially prostitutes who worked in the shrines with the temple offerings, temple sacrifices, that sort of thing. Opposed to that, we have to look at the women of the Old Testament. The women of the Old Testament were treated much better than a pagan woman, because the woman was in the home and she was considered to be the head of the home. She managed the children. She had authority over the children. And we see the same thing today. You know, the expression of, if it's a Jewish mother, the son has to obey. You know, you don't cross the Jewish mother. And we find the same thing with the women of the Old Testament, because they were made in the image of God, just as the first Adam and the first Eve. They were considered in a marriage to be an equal partner. So decisions that were made regarding the home and the family, the woman had an equal share in that. It was not just that the husband made the decision and this would stand. If there was a disagreement, we all know who won. Of course, the father would be the authoritative head of the household, taking the model of the patriarchs who were in positions of authority. But the women shared in that partnership, and there was an equality about it within the marriage itself. Women were viewed as weaker physically than men, and so they had to be protected. For whatever that meant would be determined by the husband, the father, the head of that particular household. Oh, good morning. Come in.
I made it.
Come in. All of the accounts from Bible that we read about women lets us know that the woman is considered weaker and therefore must be in a position of protection, and big, important, life-changing decisions would often have to be made for them. But they were certainly not the property of a Jewish husband. And they certainly were not abused in the sense of authority versus this nothing more than really a servant. They had a much higher position, and women were respected. Women were valued for the gifts that they had, whether it was a physical gift or a spiritual gift. And they functioned in a much freer kind of society than the men did. If we go back early enough in the Bible and look at the Old Testament women, and then we look at the beginnings of early Christianity, we can see a great deal of similarity. Because in early Christianity, because that first group of converts came from the Hebrew tradition, and they were Jewish, then they were respected and given credit for the gifts that they had. No one in early Christianity said that a woman could not speak out. She was fully entitled to say exactly what she believed or what she thought. And we don't think about that. We think about women say at the time of Jesus as being property of husbands, of being a lower class. That is not necessarily the case, because we know now from not only the Bible, but looking at other reputable sources of the society of the early Christians, we know that the women were equal in their freedoms, in their opinions, in how they conducted their lives. Women were disciples. Women would follow Jesus throughout where he traveled in that 3-year ministry. And the concept, and I've heard this a lot, the concept that women traveled with Jesus to cook for him and to provide for whatever need he had. That's not a completely honest concept of the women in early Christianity. These women were leaders within the early churches, because until we get to the 4th century, there is no church, there is no building. These people are worshiping in their homes. 313, Constantine legalized the cult of Christianity. People were free to worship without any kind of punishment or danger or anything after that edict was passed. But prior to that time, Christian worship was a home activity. And it was not unusual at all for a woman to be head of that Christian community. It was not unusual for women to preach in the early Christian church. Women were healers in the early Christian church. Women taught the sayings and the teachings of Jesus in the early Christian church. So they had a very valued position within the early church. Even Paul, who you know did not always have the best opinion of women, even Paul had to acknowledge that he would have to correspond with women. He would have to go into certain towns and villages and deal with a woman who was head of that Christian community. He may not have liked it, but nevertheless, that was the way that Christianity was constructed in the early years. And so, when you have this position of women being at least on an equal footing in the household and within the family, and the woman is viewed by the man as simply in need of physical protection, it gives us a different slant on what these women were like, what their lives were like, all of those sorts of things. So we have to look at women in a different light than popular culture presents these early women. After the time of Jesus, if we look at Jesus' 3 years of ministry, we have to think about the fact that not only did women follow him in this larger group of disciples, of followers of Jesus, Jesus had the utmost of reverence for his own mother. And she was in a very exalted position, even when Jesus was growing up. We know the temple account at the age of 12. All of those stories that come from the gospel about Mary's role in this life of Christian community just getting started. Because it's not full-blown Christianity yet, but it is moving toward that direction because Jesus has disciples that he will then, near the end of his earthly life, send out to spread this word. Jesus reveals his messiahship first to a woman. The first individual in the New Testament is the Samaritan woman. And those are the first words that we hear Jesus saying to her. I am the truth and the life and the Son of God. She was not a popular woman in society because the Jewish women did not mix with Samaritans. Samaritans were considered of a lower class. And so the Jewish women viewed Samaritans and other subgroups within the Hebrew tradition as being inferior, mainly in character. They were not as virtuous as the Jewish women were. They were not as intelligent as the Jewish women were. And they were looked down on. So, for Jesus to have a conversation with this woman was a revolutionary idea in its time, because Hebrew society would not have condoned that same sort of conversation and dialogue that goes on with the Samaritan woman. So if we look at, and you really have to look at the example of Jesus Christ, his approach to women, how he treated women, those who were in his close circle of friends, and those who maybe were in a much larger outer group that would go to hear him teach. And by and large, until the 12 disciples were sent out into the then known world to spread the gospel, until that happened, Christianity was taught by women. Hebrew converts to Christianity. Now, if it was a Christian woman who converted not from being Jewish, but from being a member of that pagan cult, she had to learn a lot, because that individual would not even understand or have any knowledge of the law. Hebrew women, Jewish women, did not go to school in the sense that the men did, but they were taught Jewish law in the home. They had to, or else they could not have kept house, because so many of the laws for the Jewish people dealt with day-to-day living. How did you cook your food? What could be cooked together and what couldn't? All of those sorts of things, the woman as the head of a household and a family had to be knowledgeable in that in order to carry it out. A pagan woman, on the other hand, who converted to Christianity, would not have that knowledge, but she also would experience the advantages that she would have by becoming a Christian. By becoming a Christian, she could think for herself and make her own decisions. She was not bound as someone's property. Jewish women could divorce their husbands. to simply go before the judge and ask to be let out of the marriage. A pagan woman could never do that because her husband owned her. And regardless of how bad the situation was, she was stuck for her life. Not so with the Jewish women. They could divorce simply by stating before a judge, I want to be released from this marriage and this is why. And if the judge thought it was a good enough reason, he would grant a decree of divorce. And then she was free. The question then became, what is she going to do? Okay. Maybe she's wealthy in her own right from family inheritance, but maybe she's not. The husband is not going to support her. If she becomes divorced from him, she will simply have to leave his home and go somewhere and make a life for herself. The pagan family didn't want her back because then she was nothing but an albatross around the neck of the pagan man. Here comes this woman back after I've already sold her to somebody who then marries her. She wants out of it. And, how does this work? So, many times we will see accounts where the Jewish woman returns to her family, her parents, her siblings. In most cases, in biblical account, it is because of the death of the husband. Maybe she has no children, so she's got to be under the protection of someone, and she'll go back to her family. We don't find an account in the Bible of a woman being granted, a Hebrew woman being granted a divorce. There are accounts in some of the apocryphal books, some of the new letters. We talked about that. We talked about heresy, about letters that were not included in the canon of the Bible, where we get a much broader, let's say, view of the society, because we find cases there where a woman has petitioned to be released from what she determines either a husband who is abusive or a husband who cheats on her. The most wonderful accounts in these apocryphal books are the woman. There are two accounts in the apocryphal books of women who leave their husbands and petition for a divorce because the husband is lazy. Well, hell, we know about that, yeah. So it's a totally different concept and a totally different idea of looking in the New Testament at stories of women. Some we know by name, some we don't. Some there will be accounts in the Bible of women that share the same name. You know how many women were named Miriam? Lots. So the Virgin Mary doesn't get any kind of special designation because her name is Miriam. Very common in that particular time. So coming into the women of the Bible, we really have to remember that the Hebrew women many times rose to positions of prominence. Queens, within a tribe or a princess within a tribe, leaders within the New Testament, within the early church. The women had a very significant place. It's not really until the medieval period that women begin to slip and slide down the ladder of appreciation and dignity and worth and all of that sort of thing. The early Christians and the early Christian church as an institution, after it was legalized, of course, had converts coming from every place. Men who converted from Judaism to Christianity knew how women were supposed to be treated. And while they would accept the teachings of Jesus and follow those teachings, they were still very familiar with the law. And if a certain religious doctrine is ingrained in a person from early childhood, it's going to be tough to get rid of it. What is it the church used to say? Give me a child until they're 6 or something, and they will remain faithful to the tradition. So within the early church, converts from Judaism, those women had a much better treated fairly. So if that pagan woman has the misfortune of being married to a pagan, then she doesn't receive that sort of treatment that those women did. Probably the worst situation to be in would be a Christian woman who was married to a pagan. Okay, so we take a pagan couple, and at some point in their lives, the wife converts to Christianity, and the husband doesn't. So he's not the least bit interested in her great conversion experience, and in fact, in most cases, he's very put off by it. Because this pagan woman who converts to Christianity will learn from Christianity that women are to be modest in their dress, are to be virtuous in how they run their household, that sort of thing. And the pagan guy back here doesn't much like that. Bring that into a modern context. Let's say the non-churched, non-religious male marries a Catholic woman. You know, he's like, what's going on? She goes to church all the time. She says her rosary all the time. All of these things that make for a collision within the family. So we find a lot of examples of that in the New Testament, in the apocryphal books, those letters that were written to the early church, and in the Quran as well. We look at the Islamic view. Women are respected in Islam. They are honored. But we can see from living our everyday lives in this country, the restrictions that are put on an Islamic woman. She does not go out in public with any part of her body uncovered except for her hands and her face. That is tradition. And it remains very strong. They have traditions of no alcohol. They have certain food restrictions. If you were to study as as a college course or something, and look at the Mosaic law and look at the Islamic law, there's not a whole lot of difference in the complexity of that law. And all of that sort of gets thrown into this big mix of the early Christian church, where we've got people from pagan cults, we've got Jews who convert to Christianity, and they bring with them all of that baggage of their lives in their tradition, in their family. And so there is much conflict, there is much confusion in this early period. If we take the writings of Peter, Peter was a good, solid Jew, and he knew the law. And we take his attitude toward women, and we compare it to that of Paul, we're going to see a very, very different kind of attitude and kind of approach to women, both in the family and within the society. But moving on through, and although we're going to talk about just women of the Bible, I want to move past that just a little bit in order for us to see what happened to women. You know, these women were healing and preaching and running churches, and we jump into the Middle Ages, and the woman returns back to this kind of state of degradation, really. Unfortunately, it's the doing of the Christian church, which puts women into a much lower position. Once Christianity is fully established and we've moved into the Middle Ages, there are only going to be a certain small group, handful of women who rise to positions of prominence. Most of those rise to a position of prominence through the church itself because they become nuns. And then they may become the abbess. If you take, for example, Hildegard, Germanic woman who came from a very wealthy family, and her family adhered to the concept which was very popular among nobility in the medieval church, and that was the 10th child born was expected to be given to the church. The 10th child. It was the tithe of the nobleman to the church. Unfortunately, Hildegard was number 10 in her family. And so she was given to a convent to live with them, to take the orders, the rule of that particular monastic order, and remain throughout her life in the convent. Hildegard was an exception to every rule because, first of all, she was well educated. She could read and write. She spoke several languages. So when she entered the convent, I think she was 8 or 9, somewhere around in there. And she was taken to a convent where her aunt was the abbess. So the parents wanted to dedicate her to the church, but they didn't want her to get too far out of the family's eyesight. And so she was sent to this convent in Germany where she was raised. The aunt, the abbess of the convent, was astute enough to continue her education so that she could continue to read the philosophers, to read the church fathers, and to get a very good, solid, round education. Hildegard, of course, became the abbess of that convent, and then she left that particular convent to found her own monastery. She was advisor to popes and advisor to kings. That's the exception that we don't find in this time. I'm talking about 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. An individual like Hildegard would be one in 100,000. But she was so highly respected by the theologians of Christianity in her day that she was very often consulted. She wrote, she had visions, lots of things contribute. If we read Hildegard's writings, we can get a very good picture of the medieval church in that time. But she was outspoken. She was outspoken. A nobleman or a king would do well not to insult Hildegard or to disagree with her, because she probably knew more than they did. That's an unusual situation. The church really, over the course of the centuries of the Middle Ages, from about 9th century to about 15th centuries, the church progressively lowered the status of women within the church institution itself. Now, how did that come about? Because Christianity had come out of this Hebrew tradition of women who were leaders, women who were healers, women who preached, women who were in positions of authority. Once we move into the Middle Ages, we find the woman descending to a lower class. And by the High Middle Ages, women cannot be in the clergy in any form, and a lot of these early Christian women were given the title of deaconess. Very common. And as a deaconess, they could lead a church community. But once the church had established its hierarchy, they went on the model that Jesus himself had set. He chose his disciples, and he only chose men. So you have to stop and say, why? Why? Because he had followers who were women. He had followers who were wealthy women. He had followers who were educated women. And he had followers that probably were infinitely more devoted to the teachings than some of those guys that he made one of the 12. I believe that the reason is simple. There will be as many people as sitting in this room who will disagree with me. But this is what I think. I think that because Jesus himself was raised as a good and faithful and loyal Jew, that he followed the Jewish concept in a much broader sense, the Jewish concept of womanhood. The Jewish concept of womanhood looks at the feminine as being, yes, weaker physically to some extent, but also to manifest a virtuous life that all people associated with women rather than men. And we hear so many references in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, about the virtuous woman and what she stands for. If you walked into a city in the 1st century or the 2nd century, you could spot a woman who was a Christian or was a Jew. You could spot them in a crowd. They dressed differently from pagan women. And that was mostly in makeup, hairstyle, and jewelry. Pagan women had an ideal of what a woman should look like, and she needed to be physically appealing to men. The Jews and the early Christians did not have that concept because they viewed women from the inside. Does she have a beautiful spirit? Does she have a kind heart? Is she generous? Is she forgiving? Is she loyal? Those virtues that were so important to early Christian women that you could right away see the difference between the two and how the two different types of women conducted themselves in public. So I really think that Jesus, because he was such a well-trained Jew, took the perspective of femininity from this ancient ideal of the woman who cared for the home, who cared for children and for her husband. And the women that he encounters as his followers were virtuous Christian women. There's no question about that. But they were not ingrained in the tradition of femininity. Those women followed Jesus wherever he went. And it doesn't say that his women followers brought their husbands or brought their children or moved their household or any of those sorts of concepts. And so I think Jesus would have chosen men to be the 12 who would do his work, simply as a favor to women, and because he respected women so much. He did not want to see women subjected to having to travel and walk all day and sleep under the stars and eat something or eat nothing, as his 12 disciples had to do. That is simply my concept. Okay? People will tell you different things. Well, Jesus really had no place for women in his teachings of God. Or Jesus didn't really like women. Or, I've heard so many people say, well, Paul really didn't like women. I'm not sure that's true. But Paul was very opinionated about women. And he would tell you right off, first, foremost, must be that women are silent. Women are silent. They do not speak out. In the community or in the church. And that rose up to bite him every chance it got. Because Paul had horrible conflicts with women, with important women, with women who were powerful. When he has to write a letter to an early church congregation, and the head of that congregation is a woman, he's going to think twice about what he says. So I don't think we can just simply say, well, Paul didn't like women. But I think we have to realize that his concept of women and their place in society is drastically different from other men that we encounter in the early church. Peter, Timothy. You can go on and on talking about these individual characters. So we look at the role of women as being very different in the early Christian church from in biblical times. Because in biblical times they had a much higher station in life than what we would normally expect. There are exceptions to that. One of the exceptions is the first woman I decided to talk about, and that's Sarah. All of my life, I have had this overwhelming desire that when I die, if you indeed can talk to people that you learned about in your life on earth, I'm going to be looking for Sarah. And I just want to ask her, how in the world did you do it? Think about it. First of all, Sarah was born in Ur, which was Mesopotamia. We don't even know for certain that Sarah was a Jew when she was born. We don't know that at all. Sarah is given a name. She will have 3 names throughout her life. Yiska is her given name, her birth name. Yiska. It means second sight. And indeed, Sarah had second sight throughout her life. She saw things and knew things that would happen that the people around her didn't. She was born into a wealthy family. She was born into a learned family. And we get the idea from reading the Quran, because Sarah is a huge player in what goes on in the Quran. we know that Sarah was a spoiled child, a special child within the family. At some point, Sarah converts to Judaism. And we think it is around the time when she was about 15 or 16 years old. And all of a sudden, she's going by a different name, Sarai. Sarai means princess. Whether Sarah changed her own name, whether her family changed it, we don't know. We just know that from the point that she is a teenager, her name is changed, and she goes by a different name. Sarai, which is a Mesopotamian name, is going to later change, and it will change when God changes Abram to Abraham. And at that point, if we look at both the Old Testament and the Quran, God changes his name to Abraham, which simply means the father of a nation. The father of a nation. And from that point on, Sarah goes by Sarah and not Sarai. It's in a different language, but the spellings are different. The pronunciations are different. So we know this is a major point that goes on within her life. In biblical times, in the times of Abram and Sarah, the Code of Hammurabi was governing authority for Islamics. And one of their laws says, if you are married to someone for 10 years and they do not produce a child, then they can be considered barren, and the husband is free either to leave her, divorce her, and take another wife, or to simply take a mistress and stay with the wife. So this was very common. So we can't assume that Sarah was not well aware of this and well conscious. But nothing really gives us any assurance that she liked the idea. Okay, she simply gives her own personal servant to her husband to produce an heir. And Hagar, her servant, gives birth to Ishmael. So, Abraham has an heir, because under the Code of Hammurabi, if the mistress or the next wife or whatever has a child and it's a male child, they can inherit from the father, even though he may not be married to the woman and there may not be a family unit. That's okay. So, we don't really know how Sarah liked it, but we do know that she accepted it and knew that this went on, and apparently agreed to this. The problem really was Hagar. Hagar was a servant of Sarah. She had no position at all in society. She was simply a servant. And she is given to Abram, who's a very powerful man. within their community. And it goes to her head. And we find in the Bible that Hagar taunted Sarah unmercifully. You know, you can't have any kids. Look at me, I'm pregnant. Like, right away. So, I must be better than you. This goes on and on and on. Ishmael is born. All of this still continues until finally Sarah's had enough. And she says to Abram, you got to do something about this, because I'm not going to live like this anymore. I have a position within this community. I have a position within the synagogue. I've had enough. So, one takes Hagar away, takes her out in the desert, and he leaves her. That's the end of that. Comes back to Sarah. So, we all know those stories. Their life goes on and on and on, and there are no children and no children and no children until they're very old. The men come. Abram tells Sarah to extend the hospitality to the men, and when they leave, they say, within 1 year, you will have a son. And what does Sarah do? Sarah laughs. Well, I think I would probably do the same thing. You know, physically and in every way, she was in no position to bear a child or raise that child. It's a very natural response to laugh. But remember, God wasn't so far away from them as he is from us. We don't expect, if we laugh at something and make fun of something, we don't expect to see God standing in front of us and saying, why did you laugh? That doesn't happen. Probably a good thing. But God really calls Sarah to task. If you believe in me and are loyal to me and are devout in your faith, why are you laughing? You know, I'm God. Don't you know you don't laugh at God? And so, while her reaction is normal, and I think it gives us a very endearing picture of Sarah, because there probably is not a woman around who in her 80s, if told that she would bear a son within a year, would not laugh. You gotta be kidding. So, after all these years, and all this putting up with Abram, and all this putting up with Hagar, Sarah has Isaac. Well, don't you think that Isaac would have been a mama's boy? These are Jewish people we're talking about. These are the Hebrew tradition. And Sarah waiting that long to have a child, and it just happens to be a boy, which is a really good thing. You know, you could have 10 girls and it wouldn't mean as much as if you had one son. I expect that her reaction and her devotion to Isaac probably would have been intolerable to watch. You know, it tells us at one point in the story, and the Quran makes a big point of this, that at one point Sarah carries Isaac around and he's 16. Okay? So, what happens? This goofball that she's married to takes Isaac off to sacrifice him. Now, Sarah would have known what he was going to do, because sacrifices were done at certain times and in certain places. She would have known exactly what he was going to do. The Quran tells us, and this is really an interesting thing if you're a Bible scholar, the Quran tells us that Abram's first choice, because God tells him, you must sacrifice your son, that his first choice is Ishmael. Abram was going to take Ishmael off and sacrifice him. But an angel tells him, no, you can't do that. You have to take Isaac. So he does exactly what the angel tells him to do. Now, all throughout this period, and this is a very interesting factor, we get a lot of clues to this in our Bible, but we get innumerable clues to this in the Quran. While everybody else, like Abram, Noah in his story and the ark and the flood and all that, messengers come to these people in the form of an angel. And so angels feature in very prominent positions. God never sends an angel to talk to Sarah. He comes himself. Which is really gives us a different concept. God promises Abraham to make of him a great nation. And indeed he does. But when God wants to tell Sarah something, he shows up. And she sees him, and she talks to him. That, talk about a revolutionary concept. There's the revolutionary concept. We know the story. Abraham gets everything ready. And we have to think from some standpoint that Isaac surely would have known what was going on. Because his father was a very old man. He could have taken his father in a split second and said, you're not going to do that. But he doesn't do that. He stands right there and watches as the fire's prepared and lit and all of this going on, even to the point of allowing Abraham to tie him up. Again, in the Quran, when we read that Ishmael is the first choice, the Quran recounts the episode where Abraham goes to Ishmael and says, God has given me an order, and I must sacrifice my son, and you are my son. And Ishmael agrees. Ishmael agrees to do that. All through the Old Testament, there are accounts of God making what to humanity seems like an unreasonable demand. But we see character after character after character in the Bible who go through this. Do you know the character in the Old Testament by the name of Jephthah? Jephthah was a commander of a great army. And he prays to God they're going into battle, and he prays to God to make his army victorious. And God says, okay, but there's a deal that has to be made. The deal is very simple. I will make you victorious, but you must sacrifice the first thing that you see upon returning from the battle to your home. Well, they live out in rugged farmland. Jephthah is surrounded by cattle. So, of course, if he goes to another land and engages in battle, and he returns to his land, he's going to see all that cattle. So he says, fine, I can do that. I can just pick out the first one I see and sacrifice to God. He goes into battle. He is overwhelmingly victorious. And he comes back home. And the first thing that he sees running out to meet him is his only daughter. He's made the agreement. And he does. He sacrifices his daughter. Because he made a covenant. He made an agreement with God. Abraham is in the same boat. He made an agreement with God. What I ask of you to show me your loyalty and your devotion and your faith is to sacrifice your son. So, in the Quran, we get Ishmael being the choice of Abraham, and an angel, or God through an angel, intervenes and says, no, it has to be Isaac. We don't get that in our Bible. In our Bible, we are simply told that Abraham chooses Isaac to be sacrificed. Well, here's poor Sarah over here. She's old. And she's got this one boy. And off his father goes to set him on fire. So, when I die, I want to ask Sarah, how in the world did you go through what you went through? We know that Sarah died as an old woman, but all we know is that she was over 100. Neither the readings of the Old Testament or any other Old Testament apocryphal books give us the precise age that Sarah was. The Quran, on the other hand, tells us that she was 129 when she died. And there is that final encounter between Abraham and Sarah where she disappears and he goes to look for her, and he goes to Hebron, which is a major city in this area, only to find out that Sarah has also gone to Hebron and died and has been buried. And so that's the last that we get of Sarah. But we learn from Sarah that she was outspoken, perhaps beyond what she should have been within society. You know, she laughed at God. That takes an awful lot of chutzpah to laugh in the face of God. But yet at the same time, she is so faithful and so loyal that she accepts things put in front of her and put in her way that we think are simply unreasonable. Giving your servant to your husband because you have not been able to bear a child. Seeing what that husband went through with his encounters with God, when he is made the father of a great nation, and his name is changed from Abram to Abraham. And she sees the sacrifice that is planned for her son. So, throughout her life, she's met with these just what seems like impossible challenges. And yet, Sarah's faith is strong. Her loyalty to God is strong. Whether she is a born Jewish woman or whether she is a convert to Judaism. And so we have to look at her as being a kind of a prototype for the covenants that God throughout biblical times will establish with his people. We have a covenant from Mount Sinai of the Ten Commandments. We have a covenant that leans more toward this age in biblical history that comes out of Jerusalem. Well, what's in Jerusalem? The temple. And so it's significant from that standpoint. And it's all of this, even as early as the story of Abraham and Sarah. All of this is setting up the Messiah. The salvation of the world through the penultimate of sacrifice, which is not Abraham's son, but God's son. And so Sarah is a prototype for that. As we go through the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about women who are virtuous, and we're going to talk about women who are vicious. And the quote-unquote bad girls of the Bible. And there's a whole bunch of them. And most of them we know by name, and we know why they did what they did, and why they fell out of favor with God. So basically what we're going to do in the next 3 weeks is to take individual women out of the Bible and look at what we know of their life stories and how that can affect us today. You know, how does that affect modern day individuals, men or women? It makes no difference. A man could laugh in the face of God just as easily as a woman. Abraham, when he was told, I will make of you a great nation, should have said, really? Seriously? I had to get involved with my wife's servant to have my first child. And the second one comes, we're too old to raise him. So the prototype, the character trait is there. Whether it's a woman, whether it's a man. That is going to be true of every character that we talk about. You can look at them by name from their life story, or you can look at them from the character that they represent and how that character interacts either with God himself or with Jesus Christ. The Samaritan woman is a prime example of that. So We're going to talk about these women, and we're just going to look at them from the standpoint of how a story, a Bible story that we tell to little kids, and what a nice, wonderful story it is. But we have to go beyond that. And we have to look at our present society and see where that character prototype would fit in our society, and how does it work? How does society affect them? How do they affect society? Because we've all known some of these bad women, the bad girls of the Bible. We've all known them. We've all known long-suffering individuals that you think, why is she still there? You know, or that sort of. So, we're looking at a story, at individual characters, but then we have to do that with the consistent approach to individuals and their character types and how they interact with faith. That's the major point. How does the individual interact with their own faith and their relationship to God? Okay? Let's have a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for the ability and the privilege of learning your word and learning about the traditions of our faith. We ask that you use it for furthering your kingdom and making our community and our world a better place. And we pray as Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.